right, we're going to get started. I understand we have a tight session here, so good afternoon and welcome to today's session on the growing importance of social and emotional development and learning. And I know you have several choices to make, so I want to say thank you for choosing to spend time with us to discuss just how important social and emotional learning is in the well-being and the development of young children, and its broader importance in building a resilient society. We know we've all been through a lot. That's been a theme of this conference. I'm Rosemarie Truglio. I'm the Senior Vice President for Curriculum and Content at Sesame Workshop, and I'm honored to be here with my colleagues and to moderate today's discussion. We've known for a long time that social and emotional development is a key component to be ready for school. In fact, at Sesame Workshop, we put self-regulation skills at the core of our whole child curriculum. It lays the groundwork for a lifetime of emotional and mental well-being so that we can lead a happy and successful life. Despite what we know about the importance of social and emotional learning, parents, teachers, physicians, and other practitioners are in the midst of an undeniable mental health crisis, including among young children. And that's what we want to focus on today, because so often we forget the young children and we think that they're so resilient and that they don't show any signs of mental health distress. This crisis can be seen in everyday moments and behaviors of young children struggling to cope with high levels of stress. We see these struggles through more intense and prolonged separation anxiety, anxiety in daily transitions, skills regressions, sleep disruptions, and just being overwhelmed by big feelings, which disrupts their daily lives. For some children, the context around COVID has heightened and intensified this mental health crisis. But these problems, as we all know, have existed way before the onset of COVID. In order for us to help children process their own reactions to stress and trauma, we have to help parents and caregivers and teachers understand what social and emotional learning is. And this really surprises me, because you would think that this would be a well-known phenomena that all the adults in children's lives will understand. But they really, truly don't have this core understanding. And we want to focus a little bit about that on today's panel. But not just focus on that, but what are the tools and strategies for them to have mental health well-being? And I think that is the big hill to climb, so to speak, in helping parents and teachers. We must acknowledge that the circle of caring adults in the lives of children are also dealing with a tremendous amount of stress. You know, we're putting a lot of burden on these caring adults, and they also need to regulate their own emotions and big feelings. So how could we, as experts, meet the needs of children and caregivers and center the social emotional learning children need to thrive through products and services, and the theme of this conference, innovative problem solving? So today, we're going to do more than ask and answer questions. We want to plant a sense of urgency with educators and experts in the field of media and the ed tech world to focus work around social emotional learning and development, and around prioritizing the whole child. And finally, I'm going to ask our panelists to really take a global perspective and think about culturally sensitive content as well as culturally sensitive assessments. So with us today is Ryan Padrez, Makeda May. So Ryan Padrez is from Stanford University and the primary school. Makeda Mays from Nickelodeon, and Mamatha Chary from Homer, and Matt Glickman from Promise Ventures. So I asked each of the panelists to introduce themselves, and in their introduction, give a brief overview of their work as it pertains to social and emotional development and learning. So we'll start with Ryan.
Great, thanks, Rosemarie. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to join you all in talking about, I think, one of the more pressing and important topics in the conference for the week. So I bring two hats, I think, to the conversation. The first is, so I'm a community pediatrician affiliated with Stanford University on faculty there, so working to serve children and families at a low-income clinic close to our university. And I'm also the medical director and one of the kind of founders of the primary school, which is on this side of the innovative models of trying to figure out how we better support the whole child through starting earlier, enrolling kids a little bit before preschool, preschool and elementary school, really supports for parents through a two-generational model, and then thinking about an integrated approach in partnerships with healthcare. And with that, we've been really privileged and lucky to be working with Sesame Workshop and our preschool curriculum that we can talk a little bit more about that's really focused on that social emotional learning and development, so supports.
Hi, everyone. I'm Makeda. So nice to be here with you all. Thank you, Rosemarie, for having me. I am the Vice President of Digital Consumer Insights at Nickelodeon, and this is a really important topic to me. It's really special to me as a media executive, but also as a mom. I have 3 kids who I've been rearing during the pandemic, a 17-year-old son, an 11-year-old son, and a 7-year-old daughter who thinks she rules the house. So that's all very interesting. But I think, from a work perspective, over the past 2 years, the better part of the past 2 years, we've been involved in a study on kids and families, kids between the ages of 2 and 12 years old, and their parents, to really understand the attitudes, values, perceptions, and behaviors. And as you can imagine, during this pandemic, it has been unprecedented times, but parents are unwavering in their commitment to find solutions. And so I look forward to talking to you more about that. One tidbit I will share is that when we did this research, we did find that mental health is a top priority for parents when it comes to concerns for their children. It ranks second only to the economy. In addition to that, on the Noggin side, we've been heavily involved in social and emotional learning with our Big Heartbeats learning program, and that focuses on SEL from a variety of perspectives, including identity and belonging, friendship, empathy, and there's even an album to accompany that, so I look forward to speaking to you all about that work and much more.
Thanks, Makeda. My name is Mamatha. I'm a learning and curriculum design researcher at Begin. My background in socio-emotional development and research on that started while I was doing my PhD at UMass. I was particularly interested in how parents, especially fathers, but other caregivers as well, can scaffold and support socio-emotional skills in preschoolers. And I've continued that work at Begin. We are an early learning company, and we create learning opportunities across all sorts of platforms, digital, tangible, experiential for children globally. And one of my main duties at Begin is to create the socio-emotional learning content that we put in front of kids, making sure that it's developmentally appropriate, that it's parent approved, that it marries parent need states, and also the research-based framework that we use. And I'm looking forward to talking more about the research that we found.
Hi, I'm Matt Glickman, excited to be here as well. I'm a co-founder and partner at Promise Venture Studio. We're a nonprofit organization that supports innovators and accelerates innovation in early childhood education and development. So we look across all health, education, social service, community programs, direct to parent. And so we're agnostic about for-profit, nonprofit status, where you're focusing. But our mission is all around trying to close the opportunity gap, helping children and families facing the greatest adversities. So while we cover a broad range of topics, we like to go deep on each, and we do a variety of programs, as I mentioned, to support organizations. We run an accelerator. We offer coaching support. The other wing of what we do is connecting events, and we have a show and tell series which gives people an overview of a topic and then highlights some of the key innovative organizations. We did one on social emotional learning a little over a year ago, and you can find that on our website at promisestudio.org. And so that's my lens of what I'm going to bring here, is highlight some of those trends and specific innovators.
Okay, so the first question is, it's easy for us to talk to parents and caregivers and educators and practitioners about the academic needs and development of children. What are the pain points when we talk about the social and emotional skills that children need to have a healthy mental health life and to be resilient? So, what are we don't have to go in any particular order. This is a discussion, so.
Well, I'd love to start. I mean, I know a lot of the parent-facing research that we've done shows that parents are concerned that their kids have lost out on these on how to scaffold these rich interpersonal relationships because of the social isolation due to COVID. So they really want to know, how can I teach my child, or how can I make sure that my child knows how to navigate social spaces and deal with conflicts that might come up? How can I empower them to be good at those things? And one thing that I've really noticed is they want support doing that. They don't necessarily want someone else to just do the work for them, but they really want to know how they can create opportunities in home or outside the home, on screen, off screen, but opportunities where they can make these learning moments happen.
I think that's really interesting, thinking about parents and the support systems in place. One of the things that we found, particularly with the parents of younger kids, is a pain point of communication. And communication is really twofold. It's about the ability to have them, thank you, Mamatha, thank you, expressing emotions and also managing those emotions. So we did a survey of parents of kids 2 to 5 years old, and they acknowledged that the vast majority of them have difficulty labeling emotions. They're familiar with words like happy and angry and sad, but less familiar with words like frustrated, lonely, disappointed, right? Those emotions that are critical, jealous, exactly, right? All of these things that kids have experienced, and really experienced much more so during the course of the past 2 years, given the pandemic. So what does that mean? When you don't have the words to articulate how you feel, you begin to act out. And you act them out sometimes during play using toys or other physical manipulatives. You might act them out in drawings. In fact, speaking of the longitudinal study I was mentioning earlier, we were engaged in an in-depth interview with a mom of 4. And during this interview, she was literally in her car driving to her son's elementary school because she received a call from the principal indicating that her son had drawn a picture of himself wielding a knife, pointing it toward another student, another classmate. And in that drawing, he had written the words, "You must die." And the mom was literally in tears falling down her face. And she said, "What happened to my baby? What happened to my baby? What did I do wrong?" And so when we think about communication as a pain point, I think there's this element of listening to what kids are saying, looking at what kids are doing, and learning how to interpret what they're trying to tell us. Because as the caring adults in their lives, the onus is really back on us to be the first responders when it comes to their social and emotional development.
Are you going to finish the story for us?
Well, I can, but I didn't want to take up too much time. But she got to the school, she spoke with the principal, and she didn't really have a reason. She saw at home what she thought was a happy, curious, outgoing child. Now, over the course of the pandemic, she said he'd been exposed to different types of things over which she didn't necessarily have control. She knew that he was increasing his consumption of certain content, and she thought perhaps that was to blame, but now she's seeking services to help him from a mental health perspective.
Okay, well, that's great he's getting the service.
Yes.
So Ryan, may want to...
Sure. Building on both of those stories, thanks for sharing those, is, as I guess two points to really make here. As the pediatrician, a lot of children are now coming back into office for well visits as we emerge from pandemic. Most of kids, if we want to narrow in on the ages of like 2 to 4, 2 to 5, did not attend preschools or other group curriculums over the last few years, and now they're coming with a touch point with the pediatrician where we're getting the first glance of where are they in their social emotional development and sort of well-being, and I'm quite concerned and nervous as there are many children out there that are well behind, I think, other cohorts of kids that I've taken care of over the years. But they're not coming in where the parents are expressing, I have a mental health concern for my child. So I think you laid that out very nicely, Rosemarie, about they're coming in with a behavior question or a behavior concern, and that's really a manifestation of potentially a delay in a domain of social emotional development or executive function that hasn't been well fostered that they get in other settings. And so I think a pain point, to answer your question, is in pediatrics, we really lack the tools right now to assess this, to identify it, to screen for it well. There are some out there, but they're not well utilized, and they're a little bit more challenging to use. And even particularly more painful is there's no resources in the community to support these families. There's very, very few programs or out there. So if it's not an obvious speech delay or a gross motor delay or something that more easily qualifies for our regionalized early start services, it's very hard to find supports for a child that has social emotional delays, unless they qualify for that mental health diagnosis in a lot of our healthcare system that's crossing a line that is a little bit too late in my mind. And so that's a real pain point that I'm feeling as a pediatrician. And then checking in on the primary school, I think now my hope is, as a pediatrician, I was like, well, it'll get better in preschool. And that's the place that most kids then finally start to develop that scaffolding support. And now the pain point upon us is to develop the preschool environment curriculum where kids can feel safe, where kids can feel connected, to start to build those building blocks of social emotional development scaffolding that they need, and that requires us as to develop those curriculums where it's really integrated into the curriculum. And so I know that at Sesame, this is a big part of what you guys have done well. Why we've been so happy to partner with Sesame Workshop at the primary school, as it's not a separate SEL curriculum. It's built into everything we're doing in terms of in our preschool classrooms. But it's a pain point. That requires work and scaffolding and support for our teachers to do that well. And it also requires some patience from our teachers and staff, because they may not gain some of those literacy, numeracy, phonemic awareness skills as quickly as other kids, because they're building up some of the other building blocks first. And those are sometimes harder to sort of see, which we'll talk about in the assessment in a minute.
Yeah, and I will add these are great comments, kind of looking across the field. I'd say pain points / opportunities, because of the optimistic nature of being an entrepreneur and what I see in others, is that I think historically at this age there was such a focus on the individual, on the child, and that's essentially a gap. I don't know if it's a pain point, in that it's really about the relational health, and that's not just with parents and other children, it's also with their caregivers and teachers. And so I think we have systemically ignored that adult caregiver, and their mental state matters a lot. How they model matters a lot, particularly for younger children. So I think we're actually seeing some green shoots where people are looking at this around the relational health. There's actually a big movement among many philanthropists and others to work and focus on the relation. I think that's one. The second is that mental health had been historically stigmatized, and I don't want to say we're out of that, but I think the challenges that we've gone through in the pandemic and otherwise have sort of normalized and made people, it's much more part of the conversation. So we've moved from looking at something that's stigmatized and hard to bring up to something that we're all going through. And I'd say the third is that this is getting to almost personalizing and kind of cultural context, that we tended to earlier on treat everything as like all kids are the same and we need to help them with emotions, and it ignored trauma, inequities, different cultural, linguistic, differences in backgrounds. And so recognizing that it's not one size fits all for all kids, but how do we personalize that? And I would say that these things all extend globally as well. I checked with some folks, there's a lot around how do we recognize for parents, in all around the world, that they're under a lot of stress, and how can we help them recognize that stress, model different behaviors, learn different skills as well.
Thank you. The pediatricians are often on the front line, for well visits and sick visits, and you don't get to talk about mental health issues very often in these visits. There's an interesting case scenario in New York City where pediatricians are now pairing with feelings doctors, right? Because you often get referred to a feelings doctor when an issue comes up. But how do we make it feel more integrated and natural? And teachers as well, they're on the front line. They're the ones observing the behaviors. So my next question is now focused on assessment then, right? Where are those assessment tools? We have clear assessment tools and benchmarks for academic skills. And we do have assessment tools for social and emotional learning. It's not that we don't, but it's harder to see measurable change over time. So considering this, how do we address SEL assessment, especially where we want to create innovative platforms that need to be, and these are the key words for this conference, need to be adaptive and data-driven? So who wants to go first with that?
I'll take a stab. That's a really tough question, Rosemarie. But, we often have this conversation. How do we effectively address SEL and make sure that we're making a difference? How do we know that we're moving the needle? And I think it's one of the most difficult topics to address, particularly in kids. We often start with the parents doing an intake to see what their reported relationships and assessments are of their children, but we know that that's not all that needs to be done. So while there's an opportunity for that quantifiable intake, I think it has to be layered with the qualitative component where you're having those in-depth conversations that allow you to probe more deeply about what those real-world, real-life experiences are. An example of innovation, I think, when we talk about interactivity and adaptability, those two certainly go hand in hand with innovation. I know that on the Noggin side, we have a series of videos called What Would You Do? And it presents scenarios of some of the Nick Jr. characters in real-world school readiness examples, right? You're in class and a new kid comes to class. What do? And you can choose between scenario A or scenario B. Right now, it's an opportunity. It's not interactive truly, but you can play along. And I think there's something really gratifying about that because it opens up the door for conversation with the parents and caregivers in the child's lives, and it provides an avenue to explore topics that kids need to be introduced to in a meaningful way. I think the other thing that's really gratifying about that from an educational perspective is it leverages those parasocial relationships and allows kids to really connect with those characters, put themselves in their shoes. So my friend Christina Francis was talking yesterday on a panel about inclusive pathways. I think of this as empathetic pathways for kids, and I think the opportunity to use those assessments, but then more broadly, reach parents through a dashboard to let them know, here's how your child is performing. Because you can watch your kid, take a glance, but there's something critical about understanding what your child is doing, where they are in that assessment, and how you can help them move the needle from a parental perspective. And Ryan, I'm just curious, and not to put you on the spot, but I'd love to know what you think about that from a pediatrician's perspective.
No, I was going to share, I think that's a great point in terms of sort of the data-driven part of this is sort of twofold, both for teachers and parents. I think as we move to this era of more better and better tools to assess social emotional development, and I'm hopeful, I'm going to remain optimistic that there's going to be more and more tools. Matt and I were in a panel this morning about some of the gamified tools in this space, and I think that's wonderful and terrific. I think we need to have equal focus on what does the data telling us to do, and so our teachers in the ECE space and our parents, I think, need a lot of scaffolding support of how to understand this and also some actionable steps of what to do. Teachers are very busy. Parents are very busy. They don't have the time to dig into the research like we do in terms of understanding what these measures tell us. And so we need to be very practical and probably some more supports there for that in order to become really usable in the school and in home settings appropriately.
Yeah, and I'll just add, picking up from the panel this morning, which was really on assessments and gamification in the early years and how, more generally, and we talked about how in this world it is looking more holistically, not just at, literacy and math and social emotional separately, but blending that together. I do think we're in early days, but there's some really interesting innovators. Cognitive Toy Box was on the panel, and they, their gamified assessments, we talked about a lot of times, it's counterintuitive. You think gamifying something for kids, that's the last we need is more like technology and games in front of kids. But it turns out in the early years, a lot of what you can test with a game with kids very young is quite effective at providing, the kind of the harder side of social emotional skills, which in the early days starts at executive function, that you can test things like cognitive flexibility, emotion identification, and regulation. And so I think we're very early days, but there are ways to begin to measure these things, and not only measure them, but measure them in ways that are more inclusive. Like some of Tammy's work showed that by making this game-based, it took away some of the implicit bias that she talked about. A study in New York where black kids were identified as being behind by humans, by teachers, but then when you did it in a game-based assessment, that difference went away. So very early days there, but I think there are ways that we can begin to at least quantify some of this so that we can create a platform to then take action. Obviously, it's about human emotions and interaction, so it's not going to be perfectly quantified, but nothing is anywhere.
Thank you so much. I wanted to bring up 2 points. One of them is that, yes, absolutely, I think what Makeda and what Dr. Padrez and what Dr. Glickman said about making sure that we use qualitative data is crucial. I think a lot of the kind of growth you see in social emotional skills might not come across in a survey, but when you have those focus groups and those structured interviews with parents, or rather semi-structured, I guess, and you ask them how things have been at home or what kids they seem to be doing, a lot of that context and richness comes out. The other thing related to that is in Begin, we have these things called I did it moments, and we often have, anytime you put out content, a play tip or a parenting blog that helps parents identify those I did it moments. And these moments don't have to be like huge. It's not like you look for the next time your child reads a word, because that's definitely a big milestone. It could also be something like pointing out words, letters they see as you're driving, and things like that. So I think by empowering parents on how they can notice these I did it moments and socio-emotional skills can also give us an idea of whether the content that we're delivering is being effective. So maybe your child is getting better at following a bedtime routine, like being able to remember the routine, plan it out, and be ready for it is part of socio-emotional skills. So I think helping parents is key in thinking about assessment. And the other thing is, when we create content, we should be really intentional to make sure that the content we're creating lends itself to assessment. So is the content dynamically leveled? Does it change as the child responds to it? Is there pieces of it that they're not responding to? And based off of that, make sure the content is child-centered, but also is changing based on their responses.
That's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up. We talk about gamifying assessment, but we also have to figure out how to gamify their ability to practice these strategies, right? We know that there isn't one strategy that's a one-size-fits-all, and children need a toolbox of strategies to help them regulate their emotions and to build these social and emotional skills. And so I think give more thought to that. How do we practice and practice and practice so it becomes more of an automatic response when you're in that moment where there's going to be a meltdown, right? All right, the last question that I'm going to pose to the panel is about how we redefine school readiness. This has been an issue that's been going on quite some time, where parents have been putting a lot of focus on the academic skills, and when they're assessing a curriculum or they're assessing what school their child is going to go to, if they have an opportunity to select a school, you don't hear them talking about building character or building executive function skills or social emotional skills. So we're still in a pandemic. What was mentioned earlier is that we're in a for now normal. This keeps changing. As educators and practitioners, how should we be redefining school readiness as we move forward?
Well, I can start, and people will be able to build. So if colleagues that know me and students I work with, they know I love to talk about school readiness, as it's one of my outcomes that I've really hung on to as a pediatrician that I love, because in my mind it's a really beautiful representation for how we're doing as a society to support our children in order to have not only the academic skills, but the language skills, the physical health, the social emotional health, the executive function. That requires a well-functioning healthcare system, developmental support system, mental health system, support for parents, and most importantly, all those social determinants that we talk about, which I like to call social influencers. Those need to be all addressed well, and if we're doing that well, the school readiness outcomes will start to unfold. And so I feel like in order to drive this change, there's two things that I'd love to see us coming out of this pandemic that we've all now started to appreciate. That's been true forever, but now we all realize how interconnected healthcare and education are for school readiness, is coming up with finally some agreed upon standards across sectors. Because right now it feels like every sector still has their own sort of tools they're using. And if we can come to some alignment and have both pediatrics and education and developmental services all start to share some of these same tools, I think that'll help move the field forward. And the other thing I want to just, kind of to move the space forward, let's not wait till kindergarten to talk about school readiness. Let's talk about preschool readiness. These are the same domains. And so maybe can we start assessing this for our 2- and 3-year-olds as they start to move into the preschool setting? Again, we'll de-emphasize on the academic skills more, but maybe emphasize more on the social, emotional, executive function learning skills that I think we could then start to societally invest more into.
Thank you, Dan.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it takes the holistic approach. And I think what I hear in what you're saying is that it's not just about making sure the kids are ready for kindergarten, making sure that they're ready for preschool, but then also sustaining that once they enter the formal school system. So when we talk to parents, we often focus on, or parents rather, often focus on their kids being academically ready. And in the midst of where we are right now, I was speaking with a principal recently, and she said, there was so much focus on learning loss that in the midst of that, people forgot about the whole child. They forgot about the mental, social, and emotional implications of what they're going through right now. The other thing I would just ask us all to think about as we challenge what this new school readiness looks like is the cultural context, right? And going back to what you were saying earlier, Matt, there's not a one-size-fits-all. And so I think when we look at those who are creating the assessments and those who are analyzing the results of those assessments, we need to make sure that they're doing so through a lens of cultural competency, because that really matters.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that back up.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that cultural competency is one of the biggest lens we need to focus on. The other thing is school readiness. Of course, we know how important it is, but part of school readiness is like knowing your letters, is knowing your numbers, knowing the cardinal rule, but also being able to take turns, being able to solve conflicts in the classroom. So how can we not only focus on school readiness, but how can we support success in both school and life? So like whole child life readiness. I think using those different terms might help us kind of change the way we think about it. I mean, we've learned that these, what is unfortunately called soft skills, and I'm stealing a line from you, Matt, this morning, but they're not very soft at all, actually.
Not at all.
As you said.
And we have to stop, I think, saying soft skills.
Let's start calling them very hardcore skills, like cognitive flexibility. And I don't want to steal any more words from Matt, so I'll let him go.
Well, I stole them from Jack Shonkoff at the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, but I do think it kind of goes back to the assessment point that a lot of emotional regulation, cognitive flexibility, those are hard skills that it takes time the brain develops. So I think if we can, this is like a movement that has to build, just like we didn't used to think of smoking as unhealthy and that seatbelts weren't mandatory. I do think we have to reframe, that it's about, that school isn't just academic. We sort of have shifted to that over the last 40, say, years, and if we can shift it back, and I'm not sure whether it's, school readiness is different than academic readiness. I use life thriving, that it's like, part of readiness for school is that you're going to be ready to thrive in life beyond. Again, piling on lots of points, Ryan talks about the integration with health. That goes throughout life. If you look at a lot of the social emotional skills, if you're healthier in that in the early years, you're going to have better health outcomes in terms of lots of stressful situations in early childhood could lead to diabetes and a whole bunch of stroke and other conditions later in life. So this really is about the parallel, thriving in life as well as thriving in school. And I'm a little hopeful we have a chance post-pandemic that people realized that school, even K-12 school, is not just education, it's care as well. It was part child care. No one wanted to admit that. Those of us in the early childhood field were saying we've got to think of early care as not just care, but early care and education. So I'm hoping that people are realizing that, part of school is that socialization, is that interaction. And if we build that into that, that will change the way we think of school readiness going forward.
I'd like to say one thing about the the culturally sensitive piece. Socio-emotional skills begin and end with empathy, and being culturally sensitive and being aware of differences and being okay and being accepting and treating those differences with affection is also begins and ends with empathy. So I don't think one can really exist without the other. I think we need to do a better job, as Makeda said, about seeing who's creating the content, who's assessing it, who's evaluating it, but not bringing that into the room would be a big disservice to socio-emotional skills.
And the precursor to empathy is perspective taking, which is part of the executive function skills. So yeah. I'm going to make a plug for my Sesame workshop. We have a book that I wrote, which is on getting ready for school, and I'm making this plug here because we talk about preparing for preschool and also for school, but so often in conferences like this, we say parents should, right? And the parenting book approach is how to help parents have a better understanding of these skills and the learning progression from ages 2 to 5, because parents do not have an education in early childhood education or even in developmental psychology. But to place these skills in everyday moments and learning through play, which I think is a really important point. So I have it out on the chair for those of you who want to take a look at it, but I think it's appropriate for this panel. Before we go to the last question, which is, I'm going to take a suggestion from Michael Levine, which I think he got from Sesame Workshop from all the academic seminars that we've done, which is called the lightning round, which I'll give each panelist an opportunity to give their last remark. We do have a little bit of time, so I'm going to take some questions from the audience.
I have a question. I'm curious about, I heard a lot about parents and sort of families and everything, which is great. I have a toddler. And I feel like I have so many resources now to talk to my 4-year-old about having big feelings and what it means to be frustrated, all of these SEL skills. But particularly feeling like I've had to learn what these skills mean to unpack my own upbringing, generational trauma, all of these things. And so I'm curious about sort of the holistic conversations that are happening about sort of teaching parents or in multi-generational households. Like I'm hoping to teach my dad, who comes from a very different place from where we are with my 4-year-old, who gets to say how he feels, when he feels, and it's not disrespectful. It's like him feeling how he feels. But so much of what we're doing is not just teaching our kids, it's teaching families. And so I'm curious about what those conversations look like, what research is saying when we're unpacking all of that.
And it's a learning curve. You're absolutely right. Okay.
It's a great point and great question. Another place this comes up often for me is differences in discipline practices between generations and parents. And fortunately, I feel the science of especially social emotional development has really helped us better understand what may be better supportive discipline practices for kids. But our grandparents or parents might not be, have read the same books. And so, and especially when in clinic, I often say, all forms of behavior are just a form of communication of what the child is trying to express, and that's just a mind shift for a lot. And so, I empathize with that challenge that you have, and I think it's one that we're going to have across many communities and many different cultures.
I think that's where this focus on relational health and on the 2-generation strategy matters, and whether, adults in general. I mean, there are programs like Near at Home is a program at Start Early where they're extending home visits to focus on, the adult taking care of themselves. So I think it's kind of what Rosemarie said, moving from the parent should world to the, adult, whether that's a parent, a teacher, or whatever, understanding themselves so that they have better, awareness and understanding, then they can interact better with child, model things better. So I do think there is this movement towards more taking that approach and realizing you have to take care of both the adult and the child. That's not an optional or a different field.
Any question over here?
If you have a child that education would be fine, say the 5-year-old going to kindergarten, but emotionally is having, it's not at that level maybe because they have been delayed out of school for 2 years. Are you recommending that they still go to school to learn those social skills, or to wait to go to school and keep learning those social skills before they go?
Well, I think this comes back to Matt's point that it's going to be very different for every child. Some children, especially if they have a lot of parental support and parents who can afford to be engaged with the school, it might be a really good idea for children to go to school and develop those social skills. But for a different type of child, especially of a different temperament, it may not be that wise to put them in a context that's so stimulating. And it may be better to take another year of I don't know if there's like half-day schools or something like that, where they can practice these skills in a less stimulating situation and then go on to another school. But I think if they're struggling in terms of SEL skills in one way, I don't think there's a one answer that fits every child.
Hi, it's been a great panel. I have a question that's for everyone, but especially for Makeda. We were talking about these assessments where you put children in a situation and ask them what the appropriate response would be. And I wonder if you have any sense from your early work on this as to whether or not what they know is right when they're in a cool state represents what they'll actually be able to do when they're in a hot or overstimulated state.
That's such a fascinating question. You know, we have not, I will say, like dug that deeply into it, but I think it's certainly a lens through which we should look at those things. That plus the idea of again, cultural context, like what do you know coming into that situation? And going back to the question that you asked earlier about your parenting style compared to your parents' parenting style. You know, you mentioned discipline. I come from a place where, yes, my parents believed in spanking, right? I don't really spank my kids, but my father-in-law was like, you need to spank that boy's butt, you know? And I'm like, well, you know, let's talk about it, right? So like this new age parenting. So there are a lot of things to consider. But I would love to talk to you more about that. I know we're almost out of time, but I'd love to talk to you more about that and hopefully be able to share some research results in the near future.
But getting to the cool versus hot, with practice, getting back to what I said, the more you practice, you hope that it becomes automatic muscle so that when you are in that hot state, you have that strategy to help. All right, we're running out of time. It's going to start flashing. But really quickly, what's the one main take-home message that you wanted this audience to walk away from for this session? Ryan.
So, since we're at an education conference, don't forget about pediatrics as your partner. That's what I want you guys to remember, especially for social emotional development.
Yes, good.
I would build on that and say, don't forget about yourself and the importance of self-care. It's very easy to sweep things under the rug and say, oh, I'll deal with that later, I'll take care of my kid, but you also need to take care of yourself and recognize that you can't heal what you hide.
And I'd just like to say we should stop calling it soft skills and start calling it hardcore skills.
Very good. No
I was going to say the same thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.